A child stands at the edge of your camp 20,000 years ago, small alone. Their group is gone, lost to sickness or hunger or a hard season that their band did not survive, but that they somehow did. They've wandered or been carried or been brought to your fire. And now they stand there in the failing light, looking at your people with nothing and no one left in the world. And your group faces a quiet, enormous decision. This child is not yours, not your blood, not your kin, not your responsibility by any cold reckoning. Feeding them means less food for your own children. Raising them means years of effort, years of care poured into a life that carries nothing of you forward into the future. By the hard arithmetic of survival, there is an obvious answer, and it is not a kind one. So what do? Do you turn away, or do you open your arms? It turns out we know more or less what ancient humans tended to do in this exact moment. Again and again, across the deep past, and what they chose tells you something profound, and frankly something beautiful, about the kind of creature we actually are. So that is the question for today. How did ancient humans raise a child that wasn't theirs, and why, against every cold rule of survival, were they so willing to do it? Stick with me, because the answer goes deeper than you'd think. First, let's be honest about why this happened so often in the first place. Because it did, the ancient world was a world without safety nets, and childhood was fragile in ways that are hard for us to sit with. Parents died, in childbirth, in accidents, in sickness, in the ordinary dangers of a hard life. Whole bands could be struck by disaster. And so, again and again, children were left behind. Children who had lost a mother or a father or both, children whose group had been scattered or broken, children who, through no fault of their own, suddenly had no one whose job it was to keep them alive. And it wasn't only loss that left a child needing new parents. Sometimes a family simply had more children than it could feed in a hard season, and another household with fewer mouths would take one in. Sometimes a couple who could not have children of their own longed for one, and a relative with several would share. Sometimes a child was simply happier or safer or better suited in another household. And so they went. The point is that the need for someone to raise a child who wasn't biologically theirs arose constantly, in 100 different ways across every human society. This was not some rare edge case our ancestors faced once in a generation. It was a recurring, ordinary part of the fabric of human life, which is exactly why they had to be, and were, so good at answering it. In our minds, conditioned by assumptions about how brutal prehistory must have been, we picture a cold response. We imagine that a hungry group, living on the edge, simply couldn't afford to take on a child that wasn't their own blood. That cold practicality would have ruled. That the parentless child was sadly doomed. And that picture is almost entirely wrong. Because here is what the evidence actually shows, both from the behavior of humans in every corner of the world and from the deep logic of how our species evolved. Taking in and raising a child who wasn't yours was not some rare act of extraordinary heroism in the ancient world. It was common. In many human societies, it was close to routine. A child who lost their parents was far more likely to be absorbed, fed, and raised by the group than to be cast out. The cold calculation we imagine simply is not how human beings actually behave, and it never really was. So how did a group with barely enough for itself so readily take on another mouth, another life, years of additional care? To understand that, you have to understand something we keep coming back to on this channel, because it is, quite simply, one of the most important facts about our species. Humans are cooperative breeders. What that means is that, unlike almost every other animal, a human child was never meant to be raised by its two biological parents alone. From the very beginning, raising a human child was a shared job spread across grandmothers, aunts, uncles, older siblings, unpartnered adults, the whole web of the group. A human baby from its earliest days was held and fed and minded by many hands. Not just its mother's care in human groups was already flowing freely between adults and children who weren't always directly their own. To see how unusual this is, look at our closest relatives. A chimpanzee mother guards her infant jealously and lets almost no one else handle it for years. There is no real sharing of care, and so there is little room for anything like adoption. A chimp that loses its mother is usually in grave trouble, because chimp society has no built-in machinery for another to step in. But human mothers in almost every culture ever studied do the opposite. They share their babies, they hand them around. From the first days of life, a human infant passes through many sets of arms, and many people invest in its survival. We are, in a sense, built to co-parent, to spread the love and labor of raising a child across more than just the two who made it. And once you see that, the mystery of adoption starts to dissolve. Because if care for children is already shared across the whole group, if aunts and grandmothers and older cousins are already feeding and carrying and raising the band's children together, then taking in one more child, even an unrelated one, isn't some bizarre departure from how things work. It is just an extension of something humans were already doing every single day. The machinery for raising other people's children was already running. A parentless child didn't require our ancestors to invent something new. They simply had to widen a circle that was already open. This is the foundation adoption. In a sense, is what cooperative breeding looks like when it goes all the way, when the shared care that every child already received deepens, for a parentless child, into a full and permanent bond. The group that already raised its children together could, without much strain on its basic way of life, fold a new child into that web of care and simply keep going. So let's talk about how it actually worked on the ground. Most often, a parentless child wasn't taken in by strangers at all. They were absorbed by their own extended family. Remember, in these tightly woven groups, a child was surrounded by relatives. If a mother died, there was often a grandmother, an aunt, and older sister already deeply involved in that child's life, already bonded to them, who simply took over. The child didn't go to an institution or a stranger. They slid one step sideways into the arms of someone who already loved them. Much of ancient adoption was really this, the kin web tightening around a child who had lost their closest person, the next ring of families stepping inward to fill the gap, and there is something quietly profound in that. For such a child, the world did not become a place of strangers. They remained among people who knew them, who had always known them. The same fire, the same belonging. The loss was real and terrible, but it happened inside a circle of people who would not let them fall out of it. Compare that to the isolation we sometimes fear today, and you see what a gift that dense web of kin really was. A child could lose the most important person in their world and still never once be alone, never once be alone, never once be without a place that was unquestionably theirs. The web caught them and held them, and they were still home. But it went beyond blood relatives, too. Children were fostered and adopted across families, across households, sometimes across entire bands. And here is something that surprises people. This didn't only happen in tragedy. In many traditional societies, children were sent to be raised by relatives or friends as a normal part of life, to strengthen bonds between families, to balance out households that had too many children or too few, to give a child to a couple who had none. Anthropologists studying these societies find that a striking share of children spent at least part of their childhood being raised by someone other than their birth parents, and that everyone involved considered this completely ordinary. The tidy modern image of every child raised only by the two people who made them turns out to be historically and globally somewhat unusual. For most of the human story, children flowed between caregivers far more freely than we tend to imagine. In fact, in some societies, sending a child to be raised by another family was a way of weaving the same kind of alliances that marriage created. A child growing up in another household became a living bond between two families, two lineages, sometimes two bands, a thread of connection and obligation, exactly like the threads we've talked about before that held the wider human world together. A foster child was not only being cared for, they were knitting their two families closer, becoming a bridge between them. So the movement of children between households wasn't a sign of weak family bonds. It was often a sign of strong ones, of families so interconnected that their children belonged, in a sense, to all of them. And this gives us a powerful clue about how readily an ancient group would take in a parentless child. If children were already moving between families as a normal part of life, if raising someone else's child was already woven into the culture, then a child who truly needed a home was not facing a closed and suspicious world. They were arriving into a way of life that already knew how to absorb them. And here is the part that matters most, the part that turns us from a story about logistics into a story about love. When an ancient human took in a child that wasn't theirs, that child did not remain, in their hearts, a charity case or a borrowed burden. Something deeper happened because of how human beings are built. The very act of caring for a child, feeding them, holding them, soothing them, watching them grow, forges love. Real love. The kind that doesn't ask whose blood it is. This is one of the most beautiful features of the human mind. Or bonding to children runs not through some test of genetic kinship, but through care itself. Hold a child through enough nights, feed them through enough mornings, worry over them through enough fevers, and you will love them fully, fiercely, indistinguishably from how you would love a child of your own body. The parent-child bond, in humans, is built by the doing of parenthood, not by the biology of it. We can even see traces of how this works in the body. The bonding between a caregiver and a child is driven in large part by the simple, repeated acts of caregiving. The holding, the gazing, the feeding, the soothing. These interactions release the brain's bonding chemistry in both the adult and the child, building day by day the deep attachment we call parental love. And crucially, this machinery does not check a child's parentage before it switches on. It responds to the caregiving relationship itself, which means a person raising a child they did not give birth to forms the bond through exactly the same path, the same nightly acts, the same chemistry as any biological parent. The body does not know and does not care whose genes the child carries. It only knows that here is a small one being held and fed and loved night after night, and it builds the bond accordingly. And that means the adopted child, the fostered child, the taken-in child, did not grow up as a lesser member of a family. They grew up in the truest sense, as a son or a daughter, loved not despite not being blood, but simply loved. Period. Because the loving had nothing to do with blood in the first place. To the people raising them and to the child themselves, the bond was not a substitute for the real thing. It was the real thing. There was no asterisk on it, no lesser grade of belonging. There was just a parent and a child, and the love between them, built the only way human love is ever really built, through showing up over and over for someone who needs you. Now here is the thing I most want you to sit with, the part that I think is genuinely profound. By the cold logic of evolution, none of this should happen. Evolution is supposed to be ruthless about reproduction. Pour your precious limited resources into your own genetic line and let everyone else's children fend for themselves. An animal that spends years raising offspring carrying none of its genes is, by that brutal accounting, wasting itself. It should have been selected against. It should have been bred out of us long ago. And yet here we are, a species that takes in the orphaned and the abandoned. That raises the children of the lost, that has done so for tens of thousands of years, and that feels, when it does, not resentment but love. Something in us overflows the cold arithmetic. Part of it, scientists think, is that the same powerful parental instincts that evolved to make us care for our own children are not perfectly targeted. They respond to any child who needs care, any small vulnerable face, any tiny hand reaching up, and what looks on paper like a mistake, caring for a child who isn't yours, turns out to be one of the most important features our species has. Now, some of this does fit the cold logic, and it is worth being honest about that. In a small band, many of the children who needed taking in really were relatives. A niece, a nephew, a cousin, a grandchild, and helping a relative's child survive does pass on some of your own genes. Since you share genes with your kin, evolution can account for that part cleanly enough. But here is what the gene logic cannot fully explain. Humans don't only adopt their relatives. We take in unrelated children too. We always have. We feel the pull toward any child in need, related or not, and once we begin to care for them, we come to love them completely. The cold math gets you partway, but human care plainly overshoots it. It spills past the boundary of the bloodline and keeps going. And that overshoot, that overflow, was not a weakness. Think about what it did for us as a species. A group whose care could stretch beyond its own bloodline was a group that left no child to die alone if it could help it. It meant that the death of a parent, even both parents, did not have to be the end of a child's story. There was always, potentially, another set of arms. A species this willing to absorb and raise its lost children was a species that could take terrible losses and still carry its young forward. That overflowing, uneconomical love was, in the end, a kind of profound resilience. It made us almost impossible to fully break. Where a more coldly efficient creature would have let its orphans fall, we caught ours, and in catching them, we made ourselves a species that endures. So that overflow of love isn't a flaw in the design. It may be one of the very things that made us who we are. We became the creatures whose care is bigger than biology, and that instinct never went away. It is all around you right now, woven so deeply into human life that you might never have noticed it for the wonder it is. Every adoptive parent who looked at a child they did not make and felt their whole heart reorganize around them. Every step-parent who chose quietly and without obligation to love a child as their own. Every grandparent, uncle, or family friend who took in a child who needed one. Every foster family, every chosen family, every household built not from blood but from care. All of it is the same ancient thing, the human capacity to look at a child who is not ours and decide simply that they are now. That capacity is older than civilization, older than writing, older than nearly everything we think of as human. It was already there, burning, in that group at the edge of camp 20,000 years ago. So let's go back to them. The child standing alone in the failing light, with nothing left, the group facing the cold arithmetic that said to turn away. What did ancient humans do with a child that wasn't theirs? Overwhelmingly, gloriously, against every hard rule of survival, they opened their arms. They widened the circle. They fed the child from their own scarce stores, gave them a place by the fire, a grandmother's lap, a new set of siblings, a name, a belonging. And through the long work of raising them, they came to love that child as fully as any they had made themselves. The child who arrived with nothing grew up with a family, not a replacement family, a real one, because in the human heart, there was never really a difference. That is the chain you come from. Somewhere back down your line, almost certainly, there are people who were taken in, and people who did the taking in, ancestors who survived only because someone who didn't have to chose to raise them anyway. We are, in part, descended from adopted children and the open arms that caught them. The love that isn't owed, that isn't blood, that isn't bookkeeping. That love is not a modern invention or a sentimental ideal. It is one of the oldest and truest things we are. So here is my question for you, and I really do want to know who in your life or your family story raised a child they didn't have to. The adoptive parent, the step-parent, the grandparent, the aunt or uncle, the family that opened its door, or were you yourself? That child caught by someone's arms that didn't have to open. Tell me about them in the comments. I read them, and these stories about the love that chose us are always the most human part of all. Until then, take care of yourselves and of each other, and I'll see you soon.